There's a king who ruled for 72 years, longer than most people alive today have been alive, and by the end of his reign, the most powerful nobles in Europe were growing out a single fingernail just to get close to him. Not metaphorically, literally, one specific fingernail, carefully maintained, because the alternative was losing everything. This is Louis XIV of France, and the way he held power wasn't just impressive, it was one of the most psychologically sophisticated control systems any human being has ever built. We're talking about a man who turned etiquette into a weapon, turned a hunting lodge into a prison, and turned debt into loyalty. And almost none of the details you're about to hear get covered in a standard history class. There are 10 facts here, and I want to be upfront. The last one is the one that almost nobody talks about. And once you hear it, the entire 72-year reign suddenly makes a different kind of sense. So stick with me. Let's start with something that sounds trivial but wasn't. You couldn't knock on Louis XIV's door. That's it. That's the rule. No knocking. If you wanted an audience with the king, you scratched on the door, gently, with your fingernail. And because access to the king was literally the most valuable thing a French nobleman could have, courtiers started growing out one specific fingernail, usually the pinky, so they could scratch more effectively. Some of them spent years cultivating this single long nail as a visible symbol of court access. Think about what that means. These were some of the most powerful men in France, and they were walking around with a groomed fingernail as proof that the king might let them in. That's not just a quirky rule. That's a man who understood that if you control the rituals, you control the people performing them. And Louis was obsessed with ritual in a way that went way beyond door etiquette. He invented a word for it, literally. The word etiquette comes directly from Louis XIV, who posted small signs, etiquettes, around the Palace of Versailles, telling courtiers exactly how to behave, where to stand, how to bow, when to speak, what to wear. And the thing is, these weren't suggestions. Breaking them meant losing royal favor, which meant losing income, which meant losing your social standing overnight. A single misstep in front of the right people could end a family's influence for a generation. So what looks like a list of manners was actually a political trap. Follow the rules and you're signaling submission. Break them and you're gone. Either way, Louis wins. Which brings us to the red heels. Only nobles of the correct bloodline were permitted to wear red high heels. This was a personal favorite of Louis XIV, and he turned it into a legally enforced status symbol. You could look across a room at Versailles and immediately know who had royal favor just by looking at their shoes. Wearing the wrong heel color wasn't a fashion mistake. It was a social catastrophe. And Louis designed it that way. Rank had to be visible. Power had to be performed. Because a court where everyone looks the same is a court where nobody knows who to defer to. And Louis needed deference flowing in one direction at all times. Now here's something that sounds almost too strange to be real, but it's documented. If Louis wasn't in a particular room and a courtier walked past his portrait, they were expected to bow or curtsy to the painting. To a canvas, in an empty hallway. His authority was so systematically enforced that it extended beyond his physical presence entirely. And the remarkable thing is that courtiers did it. Because by that point, the behavior wasn't even conscious, it was reflex. That's what years of ritual conditioning does. It stops being performance and starts being instinct. But Louis wasn't just managing behavior, he was managing money. According to Britannica, Louis deliberately encouraged his nobility to gamble. He lured them to court, surrounded them with luxury, and created an environment where spending was expected and debt was almost inevitable. And a noble who owed money, especially money that could theoretically be called in by the crown, did not plot against the crown. Financial dependency was political loyalty. It's a remarkably cold calculation. Don't just win people over, make them need you. The gambling wasn't a side effect of court culture. It was the point. And this connects directly to Versailles itself, which is where the whole system physically lived. Versailles started as a hunting lodge. Louis XIV's father used it as a modest retreat. Louis XIV turned it into the most expensive, most elaborate, most magnificent palace in Europe. And the reason he did it had almost nothing to do with aesthetics. He moved the seat of French government there and brought the entire nobility with him. Nobles who left Versailles without permission lost their income and their position, so they stayed. And while they stayed, Louis could watch them. He knew who was talking to whom, who was in debt, who was angling for favor, who was falling out of it. The most opulent prison in history had no locks, no bars, no guards at the gate. It didn't need any. The incentive structure was the prison. Now we're about halfway through, and I want to come back to that last fact I mentioned, the one that reframes everything. But first, there's one story I have to tell you because it shows exactly how Louis handled anyone who didn't play along. The Marquis de Montespan found out his wife had become the king's mistress, and instead of staying quiet about it, he dressed his carriage in black mourning cloth and publicly announced that he was grieving his wife who had disappeared. It was a pointed, very public statement, and Louis XIV's response was to have the man jailed. Not for exposing the affair. Everyone knew about the affair. He was jailed for the rudeness of pointing it out in public. Because in Louis's court, the performance of reality mattered more than reality itself. You could know things, you just couldn't say them. So we've got ritual control, financial control, physical control through architecture, and social control through reputation. And all of it was sustained by one man doing something that almost no monarch before or after him ever committed to. For 54 years, Louis XIV did approximately 8 hours of government work every single day, with no prime minister, by choice. The morning after his mentor Cardinal Mazarin died, Louis XIV, 22 years old at the time, announced to his court that he would govern alone. No chief minister, no one to delegate to. His court didn't believe him. Why would they? He was 22, but he did it. Every day, for the rest of his life, he personally reviewed administrative decisions, foreign policy, military matters, financial records. Nothing of significance happened in France without passing through him. That's what 54 years of consistent daily attention to power looks like. Not genius, not luck, just relentless, daily documented work. And speaking of documented, there's one more detail about Louis's reign that is genuinely hard to believe until you see the source. His royal physicians kept a document called Le Journal de la Santé du Roi, the Journal of the King's Health, in which they recorded, among other things, every single enema the king received during his reign. The total came to approximately 2,000, every one of them logged. This wasn't just obsessive record-keeping for its own sake. It was part of a broader culture at Versailles, where the king's body was essentially public property. His waking up, his going to bed, his meals, all of it was ritualized, witnessed, and documented. Because in a court built on performance, even the king's health had to be seen to be managed correctly. Now here's the thing I promised you at the start, the detail that makes the whole reign look different. Louis XIV outlived his son, his grandson, and most of his great-grandchildren. His son died in 1711. His grandson died in 1712. Another great-grandson died shortly after. By the time Louis XIV himself died in 1715, after 72 years on the throne, the person who inherited the most powerful monarchy in Europe was a 5-year-old child, his great-grandson, because Louis had simply outlasted everyone else. And that's the thing about the entire system he built. The fingernail ritual, the etiquettes, the red heels, the gambling debts, the palace with no locks, the 54 years of solo governance, none of it was accidental. It was a man who understood at some fundamental level that power isn't taken, it's maintained. Day after day, ritual after ritual, debt after debt, until the people around you can't imagine the world working any other way. He didn't just rule for 72 years, he made 72 years of rule feel inevitable. If you want more of this, real history that's actually stranger than anything anyone would make up, there's another video right here that goes deep on a different ruler who used an equally insane method to hold power. And if you're new here, subscribing actually helps more than you'd think, because it's how this kind of content reaches people who'd never find it otherwise. Drop a comment with which of these 10 facts surprised you most. I'm genuinely curious whether it's the fingernail or the 5-year-old heir, because those two always split the room.